The wind carried whispers across the plains, whispers of a story that would rattle saloons and church pews alike, a story that began with nothing more than a piece of bread. Folks in the county would speak of it for years, lowering their voices when they mentioned the name Elias Boone, for his choice in one desperate moment set the land on fire. If you had ridden through the county back then, you might have seen nothing more than a poor rancher bent against the wind, his bones sharp beneath worn skin, his hat pulled low to hide the hunger etched into his face. But what you wouldn't have seen was the storm that trailed him, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. And that spark came one cold night when a starving child stumbled into his life. Elias Boone lived on the edge of nothing. His ranch was no grand spread, only a few acres of tired land with fences sagging and cattle too thin to fetch more than a handful of coins. His house creaked in the wind like it wanted to fall, the boards warped, the chimney blackened from years of smoke. He was a man who worked from dawn till moonrise and still ended each day with less than he started. His pantry had been stripped bare by drought, locusts and bad luck, leaving only a crust of bread on the shelf, the last remnant of a winter's supply. He had thought to save it for the next day, to stretch his hunger a little longer. Hunger had been his companion so long, it clung to him like a shadow. But the prairie has a way of testing men when they are weakest, and it tested Elias that night. He heard it first as a rustle outside his barn, a faint shuffle in the dirt. His first thought was coyotes, the second was thieves, but when he lifted the lantern and stepped into the dark, what he found was neither. A girl no older than 13 crouched against the barn wall, her frame thin as a willow branch, her hair tangled, her face smudged with dust. Her eyes met his lantern light, black and wide, filled with fear but also something else, a pride that refused to bow even in hunger. She did not beg, did not speak. She only looked at him, as though daring him to chase her away. Elias felt his jaw tighten. "You got no business here," he muttered, though his voice lacked the steel of conviction. The girl's lips trembled, and her hands clutched her stomach. He had seen that look before, in the mirror most mornings. Hunger recognizes hunger. He could have turned his back. He could have left her to the night and gone inside to guard the only meal he had left. Instead, his boots carried him back to the cabin, his fingers reaching for that lone crust of bread. When he returned, she was still there, watching him with the wary eyes of a cornered fawn. He broke the bread in half, the sound of the crust cracking louder than the wind, and held it out. She hesitated, then snatched it from his hand with the speed of desperation, cramming it into her mouth before she could think better. He gave her the other half too, though his belly roared in protest. She chewed slowly, then lifted her gaze to his. A fragile thread had been tied between them in that moment, one neither could have imagined would stretch into blood and fire. By dawn, she was gone, leaving only footprints in the dust. Elias thought that might be the end of it. But in the county, nothing stays quiet. A neighbor driving cattle past had spotted the girl slipping from Elias's barn and carried the tale into town. By the time the sun set that evening, men were already muttering in the saloon. They said Boone was feeding Injuns while his own neighbors scraped for scraps. They said hunger made him weak, and weakness made him dangerous. By the third day, his name was being spat like a curse. Sheriff Dugan rode out on the fourth day. He was a man who carried the law in his bones. His shoulders stooped beneath the weight of it. His horse kicked up dust as he approached the Boone ranch, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the sagging fence and weary man who stood before it. He dismounted slow, his spurs clicking. "Elias," he said, voice low, words spreading faster than a prairie fire. "They're saying you gave what little you had to one of them. You know how folks are in this county. They'll call it betrayal." Elias didn't flinch. "A hungry child ain't an enemy," he answered. The sheriff studied him a long moment before spitting into the dirt. "Sometimes it don't matter what's right. Sometimes it only matters what folks believe. And right now, they believe you're a fool." Elias stood alone after the sheriff left, his heart a tangle of fear and defiance. He had done what his conscience demanded, but already he felt the walls of the county pressing in on him, the weight of eyes judging, waiting. That night, sleep eluded him. The creak of the windmill sounded like boots on wood, the hoot of an owl like a rifle being cocked. He told himself it would pass. But it did not pass. 3 days later, Elias woke to the sound of hoofbeats rolling across the plains like distant thunder. He stepped outside and froze. Across the ridge, silhouetted by the rising sun, a line of riders appeared. They came slow, steady, each one painted in colors of war, feathers and steel glinting. The girl rode with them, her face solemn, clutching something in her small hands. It was the crust of bread he had given her, wrapped in cloth as though it were treasure. She spoke in her tongue, her voice carrying across the silence. Elias couldn't understand the words, but he knew the meaning. She had told them of his kindness. Before he could breathe, another sound reached him from the opposite ridge. Settlers, ranchers, and drifters with rifles slung across their backs had gathered, their faces twisted with fear and anger. The valley floor lay between the two groups, a strip of land that could turn to a graveyard with one wrong move. The girl's people stared down the settlers, and the settlers gripped their rifles tighter. Dust hung in the air, heavy and still, waiting for a spark. Elias's throat tightened. He stood between them, one man against two storms. His neighbor's eyes burned with betrayal. He saw Tom Grady, a man who'd once shared whiskey with him, now glaring as though Elias were the devil himself. He saw the sheriff too, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, face grim. On the other side, the riders sat like stone, silent, watching. The girl's gaze found Elias again, pleading without words. She believed he could stop it. But could he? He stepped forward, his voice cracking as he shouted across the valley. "These are people, same as us. Don't you see she was starving? Would you let your own daughter die in the dust?" The settlers shouted back, their voices rough with fury. "They killed our kin. They raided our stock. You take bread from your own mouth to feed the wolves." Elias felt his chest tighten. He wanted to scream that hunger knew no enemy, that mercy was the only thing that could bridge the gap. But in the faces before him, he saw no mercy, only fear, and fear always draws blood. The sheriff's horse stamped nervously. "Elias," Dugan called, voice heavy, "step aside. This ain't your fight." Elias shook his head. "It is now," he said, though his hands trembled. He had never been a man of courage, never been more than a poor rancher fighting to keep his land. But here, in this valley of dust, he found himself standing between two armies. He knew that if he moved, if he faltered even an inch, death would ride fast and merciless. The air grew so still it hurt. A hawk cried overhead, circling the sky. The girl clutched his arm, her small fingers digging into his skin. Elias closed his eyes for a moment and prayed. Not for himself, but for the madness to pass, for the land not to drink more blood. When he opened them, the world seemed sharper, every detail burned into his mind. The glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel, the feather tied to a warrior's lance, the sweat trickling down Tom Grady's temple. Time stretched, each second dragging like an eternity. And then it broke. A single gunshot split the silence, ringing out across the valley. No one saw who fired, but the sound tore through them like lightning. Horses reared, settlers shouted, riders shifted in their saddles. The world erupted into chaos, and Elias stood in the middle, heart pounding, knowing the fire had finally caught. What happened next would shake the county forever.